Welcome back to Sleepy History Stories. Tonight we're moving into a quieter part of the medieval world. Not the grand halls or the stories written down, but the everyday places where people worked. The fields and workshops, the kitchens and mills, the streets worn smooth by hundreds of feet. The places where ordinary people spent their days, doing necessary work. If you haven't already dimmed your lights, settle yourself somewhere comfortable. Let your body find its weight. Feel the surface beneath you. Feel the temperature of the air. You might turn on some soft background sound, just enough to fill the silence, without demanding your attention. We'll begin slowly now. A quiet evening settled over the narrow street. The last light faded from the windows. The day's work was ending, though not yet finished. There was still the settling of things, the putting away of tools, the long sighs that come when labor winds down. But the main work was done. In medieval Europe, if you were born without land, without privilege or family connections, your life would be measured in work, not in great adventures or dramatic moments, but in the daily repetition of tasks. The same work day after day after day. Some work was harder than other work. Some kept you wet from morning until dark. Some filled your lungs with dust or smoke. Some meant handling things that others preferred not seeing. Some left marks on your body, marks that took years to fade. But the deepest part of most medieval labor was not something sharp or sudden. It was steady. It was constant. The kind of tiredness that rose with you, that followed you to bed at night. A heaviness that became so familiar, you barely noticed it anymore. It was just the shape of existence. So tonight we're going to follow an observer, someone who has come to a medieval town. They will spend a day and night witnessing what happens here, the work, the spaces, the people, not to judge, but simply to see, to understand what it was like, to live in a world where the comfort of some depended entirely on the labor of others. The observer wakes before dawn. The room is dark and cold. There's no window, or if there is, it hasn't yet lightened. The observer lies still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the town waking, a rooster calling from somewhere beyond the buildings, the creak of a door opening, footsteps on cobblestones, moving with purpose. The observer stands slowly, feeling the stiffness of sleep in their joints. The ground beneath their feet is stone, worn smooth by time. It's cold. There's a pitcher of water on a shelf. The observer washes their hands and face. The water is cold. It shocks the skin awake. It clears the mind. The observer dresses in simple clothes, the kind that don't mark them as wealthy or poor, just traveling. They step outside. The town is beginning to wake, but it's not yet busy. The light is still gray, more darkness than day. The sky is the color of wet stone. There's moisture in the air. The observer feels it on their skin. The buildings around the square are shuttered still. Most people are not yet awake, but some people are. The observer sees a few figures moving through the streets. An old woman carrying a bucket, a man rolling something on a cart, a young person running toward the edge of town. These people move with the ease of practice. They know the path even in the darkness. The observer begins to walk, following the general direction of the activity. The streets are narrow and wind between buildings. The observer has to watch carefully, watching to not stumble on the uneven ground. Someone has splashed water across part of the street. The observer's feet are damp. By the time they reach the edge of town, the countryside opens up suddenly. The houses and workshops end. There's nothing but open field. The light is slightly better here, away from the shadows of the buildings. The sky is beginning to show the smallest hint of color. Not quite gold, not quite even orange, just a suggestion of where the sun will appear. There's a man standing in the field. He's alone. He's dressed in rough cloth that's stained and worn. His boots are caked with dried mud. He's holding a tool that looks heavy. He seems to be examining the ground. The observer approaches slowly. The man doesn't react to the footsteps. He's looking at the earth. turning over a small handful with his fingers, examining it. He releases it and lets it fall. This is a field laborer. This is where the day will begin. The observer asks what he's doing. The man doesn't look up immediately. He examines another handful of earth before he answers. He says the soil needs to be broken. The winter has compacted it. He's checking to see if it's soft enough, or if he needs to wait another day. He's checking to see what the moisture is like. The earth doesn't give much away, but if you know how to read it, it tells you things. The observer watches as the man prepares his tools. There's a heavy spade, a kind of plow, ropes. Everything is worn and patched, but well maintained. The man has clearly invested in these tools. They're essential. Without them, there's no way to make a living. The sun breaks the horizon. It happens suddenly, the way it does at this time of year. One moment the light is all gray and ambient. The next moment there's a source, a point of brightness that casts shadows. The field is suddenly more real, more textured. You can see the grass that remains from last year. You can see the places where frost has broken the ground. You can see how much work there is to do. The man takes the heavy tool. He moves to the section of the field where he'll start. The observer follows, watching. He plants his feet firmly. He raises the tool. He brings it down. The earth resists. His whole body strains against the resistance. He plants his feet again. He brings it down, and again, and again. The motion is rhythmic, though not fast. This is work that requires steady effort, not speed. The observer stands at the edge of the field, watching this happen. The sun rises slowly higher. The light improves. The man continues, stroke after stroke. The earth gradually breaks. He moves forward, perhaps 10 feet. The earth behind him is looser, darker, ready to be worked further. The work is not interesting. There is nothing dramatic happening. There is only the repetition of the same motion, the same resistance, the same gradual progress. The observer realizes something. They could watch this all day and see fundamentally the same thing happening over and over. But something in this repetition is calming. There is no thinking required. There is no complicated decision-making. Just the body doing what it knows how to do, the earth gradually yielding. By the time an hour or so has passed, the observer realizes they're tired just from watching. The man must be even more tired. But he doesn't stop. He continues. Around midday, the light is bright, almost harsh. The sun has climbed high. The man's face is flushed from the effort. His shirt is dark with sweat. His hands are gripping the tool with that particular tightness. That comes from holding something heavy for a long time. He sets the tool down. The observer watches as the man walks to the edge of the field where he's left some supplies, a cloth sack, a water skin. He drinks from the water skin. The water runs down his throat. He drinks more. He opens the cloth sack. There's bread, just bread. He breaks off a piece. He eats it slowly, not with any particular enjoyment, but with the mechanical motion of someone putting fuel into their body. He sits on the ground. His legs stretch out in front of him. The observer can see how tired he looks now. The exhaustion is written across his face, but it's a familiar exhaustion, not the shock of sudden pain, not the shock of sudden effort, but the accumulated weight of hours of work. The man closes his eyes for a few moments. He's not sleeping. He's just resting, letting his body experience something other than effort for a brief time. The observer sits down nearby without being invited. The man opens his eyes. He looks at the observer with mild curiosity, but he doesn't object. They sit in silence for a while. The breeze moves across the field. There's no sound except the wind and the far-off sounds of the town. A bird calls from somewhere distant. The observer asks a question. What determines how much of the field he can break in a day? The man looks back at the field. Considering the question, he says it depends on the earth. Some days the earth is softer, and it goes faster. Some days it's harder, and you don't make as much progress. It depends on the moisture. It depends on how rested you are. It depends on how much time you have. By autumn, when the harvest is urgent, the work moves faster because you have to push harder. In spring, you can work at a steadier pace. He says in a good day, he can break maybe a quarter of his section of the field. In a hard day, maybe a fifth. Some days are good. Some days are harder. The observer asks if that bothers him. Does he want to do more work, or is he content with what he accomplishes? The man takes a moment to answer. He seems to be considering whether this is a real question or just something to say. He says the work is the work. He does what he can. If the land was his own land, maybe it would feel different. But the land belongs to the Lord, and he's paid to work it, so he works. The goal is not to do more than necessary. The goal is to do what's required, and then rest. The observer nods. This makes sense. There's no dramatic dissatisfaction in what he's saying. He's simply accepting that this is how things are. The man stands and stretches. His back cracks in a way that sounds painful, but he doesn't react to it. He picks up his tool again. He looks back at the observer. He says the observer can keep watching, if they want to, but he's going to continue working. There's a lot of field left. The observer watches as the man returns to his work. The motion begins again. Effort, strain, resistance, gradual progress. The sun is at its highest point now. The shadows are short and small. There's no shade anywhere on the field. The observer stands. The observer moves to the edge of the field, finding a slight rise in the ground where there's a small amount of shade from a tree that's growing at the boundary between the field and the wilderness beyond. From this position, the observer can see the man working, but they're not directly in the sun. It's marginally more comfortable. The observer sits on the ground. Time passes in a way that's hard to measure. The sun moves slowly across the sky. The man continues working. The field gradually changes. More of it is broken. More of it is ready for the next stage of work. The observer's eyes grow heavy. There's something about watching repetitive work that is deeply calming. The rhythm of it becomes like a heartbeat. The mind can settle into it and simply observe, without trying to figure anything out or make sense of anything. The light begins to change. It's no longer at its highest point. It's beginning to move toward the west. The shadows are growing longer. The man straightens up more frequently now, stretching his back, rolling his shoulders. He's growing tired in a way. That's becoming harder to hide. He works for perhaps another hour. Then he sets down his tool. He looks at the work he's done today. There's a visible section of the field. That bears the marks of his effort. It's a tangible accomplishment. Tomorrow there will be another section, and the day after that another. But today, this section is done. He picks up his tool. He leaves his supplies where they are for now. He walks back toward the town. The observer follows. The walk back takes less time than the walk out this morning. The observer's legs feel heavy from sitting for so long. The observer can only imagine what the laborer's legs must feel like. He's walked out here, worked all day, and now he's walking back. The sun is lower now. The light is approaching that golden quality. It takes in late afternoon. The temperature is beginning to drop slightly. The observer can feel it, despite the walking. The man leads the observer through the streets of the town. He turns into a small area where several simple buildings stand. He enters one. The observer pauses at the door, but the man doesn't object. The observer follows. Inside is a single room. There's a small fire burning in one corner. There's a simple bed against one wall. A few tools hang on the other walls. A shelf with a few pots and items of food. There's a small table with a single chair. The man pours water from a pitcher into a bowl. He washes his hands and his face. The water is brown when he's done. He dries himself on cloth. That's hung by the fire. He brings water in a cup. He drinks it. He brings bread from the shelf. He eats it. He sits on the edge of the bed. The observer realizes something. The man has not spoken to them since they left the field. There's no particular hostility in this. It's simply that there's nothing more to say. The work is done, and now it's time to rest. The man lies back on the bed. His eyes close. The observer stands there for a moment, uncertain. Then they quietly leave, closing the door behind them. Outside, the sun is continuing its descent. The light is richer now, warmer. The sky is turning orange and pink at the horizon. The streets of the town are busier than they were this morning. People are moving through them. Some are still working. Some are preparing meals. Some are simply moving about, doing the tasks that must be done. Before darkness arrives, the observer begins to walk through the town. This is a different kind of exploration now. This morning the observer was observing one specific type of work. Now they're trying to understand the whole landscape of work. That happens here. The smells are the first thing the observer notices. There are many different smells, layering on top of each other. The smell of smoke from cooking fires, the smell of animals, the smell of something else. That's harder to identify. It's sharp and chemical, in a way that's unfamiliar. The observer follows this smell. It leads to a building that's set slightly apart from the others. The roof is lower. There are vats visible through the open door. There's water. There's cloth. This is where the fuller works. The observer enters. The workspace is immediately overwhelming. To the senses, the smell is strong and sour. The air is thick with moisture. The light is dim inside. Despite the open door, there are several large wooden vats filled with water. Cloth is hanging in various states of being processed. There are tools scattered around. The floor is wet and slippery. A person is standing at one of the vats. They're working cloth through the water. Their hands are in the water, up to their wrists. Their sleeves are rolled up. They're wet as well. This is the fuller. The fuller looks up. As the observer enters, there's a moment of appraisal, of figuring out what the observer is and whether they're here to cause trouble or make a purchase. The observer asks if they can watch. The fuller considers this. They shrug slightly, which seems to mean yes. They return to their work. The observer stands back from the vats, trying to stay out of the way. The observer is trying not to drip water onto their clothes, as the moisture in the air seems to coat everything. The fuller works the cloth through the water. The motions are practiced and efficient. The cloth is pulled, pushed, turned, folded. The fuller examines it periodically, checking something that the observer can't quite discern. Is the fiber right? Is the color changing appropriately? Is the grease beginning to break down? The observer realizes they could ask, but they also don't want to interrupt the work. There's a rhythm to what the fuller is doing. It would be wrong to break it. The fuller moves the cloth from one vat to another. This vat contains something different. The smell is even stronger here. The observer tries not to react to it, but it's difficult. It's the kind of smell that seems to coat the inside of your nose. The fuller doesn't seem to notice the smell anymore, or rather, they seem to have accepted it as part of the work, the way the field laborer has accepted the heaviness of the tool. Time passes. The fuller works through the cloth. That was brought today. Each piece goes through the same process. Water and motion. A different liquid and more motion. Checking. Assessing. Moving to the next stage. The observer becomes aware of something, of how tired the fuller must be. The work requires constant motion and constant attention. There's no moment when you can simply stand still. Even when you're examining the cloth, you're standing in the moisture and the smell. The light outside is growing dimmer. The sun is lower now. The fuller works a bit faster, as though trying to finish what they've started, before darkness makes it harder to see. Finally, the fuller seems satisfied with the day's work. They rinse their hands in clean water. The water that rinses off has a color to it, the stains of the day. The fuller rinses their hands a second time. The water is cleaner now, but not entirely. Some of the stains remain, embedded in the skin. the creases of the hands, under the fingernails. The fuller dries their hands on a cloth. They look at the cloth they've been wearing. It's wet and stained. They take it off. They hang it somewhere to dry. They stand there for a moment, looking at the vats and the space. They sigh. It's the same sigh the field laborer gave, the sigh of work being done for the day. The fuller looks at the observer. They ask if the observer has any cloth. That needs finishing. The observer says no. They're just observing. They're trying to understand what happens in this town. The fuller nods. They say everyone should understand. What work is really like? Most people just see the finished cloth. They don't think about where it comes from. They don't think about the work. That has to happen before it becomes something pleasant. The observer asks if the fuller minds the work, if they mind the smell, the moisture, the constant motion. The fuller considers this. They say you get used to it. At first it's overwhelming. You feel like you can't breathe, but after a while your body adapts. The smell becomes just part of the sensory landscape. Your hands stop being entirely tender. You develop the muscles you need. The fuller says the worst part isn't the smell or the moisture. It's that the work never really ends. There's always more cloth coming. There's always another batch to process. It's the constancy of it that gets to you more than anything else. The observer nods. They ask if the fuller gets days off. Time to rest. The fuller laughs a little. They say there's one day a week when they're supposed to rest. Sometimes they do. Sometimes the work doesn't allow it. If a merchant needs cloth urgently, you work. If you don't work, you don't earn. If you don't earn, you don't eat. This is stated in a matter-of-fact way, not with complaint or drama. It's simply the reality. The observer thanks the fuller and begins to leave. The fuller calls after them. They ask if the observer wants to see what the work looks like at the tanner's place. The fuller says the tanner is worse than the fuller. At least the fuller works with cloth. That becomes something beautiful. The tanner works with something that most people would rather not think about. The observer asks where the tanner works. The fuller points to the edge of town. They say, follow the smell. That's worse than this one. And you'll find the tanner. The observer leaves the fuller's workspace. Outside, the air seems clearer and fresher, though the observer knows it's probably not. The observer has simply adjusted to the smell inside. The sun is much lower now. It's approaching that time when you have to decide whether to use the remaining daylight or to wait and use fire. The streets are busier than ever. People are preparing evening meals. Children are playing in the streets. Someone is drawing water from a well. The observer walks toward the edge of town, following the direction the fuller indicated. As the observer gets closer to the edge, the buildings become smaller and less substantial. This is where people with less means live. The buildings are further apart. There's less of a sense of community and more of a sense of isolation. The observer smells it before they see it. The smell is sharp and strong, in a way that makes the fuller's workplace seem almost pleasant in comparison. It's the smell of something, being treated with substances that are powerful and chemical. The observer finds the workspace at the very edge of town. It's a low building with large windows and doors that are open to allow for ventilation. Inside, hides are stretched across frames. Tools hang from walls. There are tables where work is being done. A person is standing at one of the tables. They're working a hide with a sharp tool, scraping at it. The scraping makes a sound. That's distinctive. The tool edges hit the hide, and the tissue peels away. This is the tanner. The tanner looks up. The tanner's face is stained, not with water, but with something. That's become embedded in the skin. The tanner's hands are the same color. It's not dirt. It's something in the substances they work with that has stained them permanently. The observer enters slowly. The smell is so strong that it seems to have a physical presence. It's almost hard to breathe. The tanner asks what the observer wants. The observer says they're observing the work. That happens in this town. The tanner says everyone should see what this work is like. Everyone should understand where leather comes from. Nobody wants to think about it, but everyone wants the leather products. The tanner returns to work. The observer watches as the tanner scrapes. At the hide. The motion is repetitive and forceful. The tanner has to use strength to do this work. The hide resists. The tool has to be sharp and strong. As the tanner works, small pieces of tissue and membrane come off. The hide gradually becomes cleaner, more pliable, more like something that could become a useful product. The tanner works for several minutes while the observer watches. There's no conversation. There's just the sound of the tool, scraping against the hide. Finally, the tanner sets the tool down. They examine the hide. It's still in the early stages of processing. There will be more treatment, more handling, more work before it's finished. The tanner washes their hands in water. But the stains don't come out. The observer wonders how many times. The tanner has tried to wash their hands, only to find the stains returning. The observer asks the tanner a question, if they ever consider doing different work. The tanner looks at the observer with an expression that suggests this is a question they've been asked before, or have asked themselves many times. The tanner says there isn't different work, not if you're born in a position like this. You learn a trade from your parents, or from someone in your family. The tanner's parent was a tanner, so the tanner is a tanner. It's not something you choose, it's something that chooses you. The observer asks if the tanner minds, being at the edge of town, separated from the main community. The tanner says at first it bothered them. But you get used to that too. You understand why people prefer to be downwind. The work is necessary, and the work requires distance. The tanner says most people don't realize that leather is necessary. They think it just exists, but someone has to scrape the hide. Someone has to treat it. Someone has to do the work. That makes leather exist. If nobody did this work, there would be no shoes, no belts, no bags, nothing. The tanner says that knowledge is sometimes cold comfort, but it's something. The observer thanks the tanner and begins to leave. The tanner calls after them. They ask if the observer wants to see something worse. The tanner says if they follow the path. Past the tanner's building, they'll reach the workspace of the gong farmer. The observer asks what time the gong farmer works. The tanner says the gong farmer works at night. They work in darkness. They handle things that people don't want to think about during the day. The observer asks if the observer should come back at night to observe this work. The tanner says that's up to the observer. But the tanner suspects the observer might not have the constitution for it. Most people don't. The observer thanks the tanner again and continues walking. The sun is lower now. The light is becoming golden and warm. The observer realizes something. They've been walking and observing all day. The observer is tired. There's an ache in their feet and legs from the walking and standing. The observer decides to return to their lodgings. For now, night will come, and the observer can decide then whether to continue observing or to rest. The streets of the town are bustling. As the day ends, the observer is moving against the general flow of people. People are moving toward the center of town, toward gathering places, toward homes. The observer is moving toward the quieter edges, then back toward the center again. The observer passes the fuller's workspace again. The doors close now. The fuller is inside, presumably resting. The observer passes other buildings. Some are clearly homes. Some are clearly workplaces. Some seem to be both. The observer passes a mill. This is where grain is ground into flour. The observer pauses and looks inside. The workspace is dim inside, but the observer can see the grinding wheel. It's a large wheel that's turned by water. The wheel is turning slowly now as the light is fading. An assistant is feeding grain into the top of the grinder. The grain falls down and is crushed by the stones inside. The sound is loud, even from outside. The observer can hear the grinding sound. It's a continuous noise, rhythmic but also mechanical, in a way that's different from the rhythmic motion of the field laborer or the fuller. The observer enters the mill. Inside, the sound is louder than expected. The air is filled with dust. It's the kind of dust that floats and seems to hang in the light from the small windows. The dust gets in the observer's nose and throat. Immediately, a young person is working here. They're covered in dust. Everything about them is dust-colored, from their clothes to their skin to their hair. They're thin, as though the constant inhalation of grain dust has somehow eaten away at them from the inside. The young person looks at the observer with tired eyes. They don't seem surprised to see the observer. They simply continue their work. The observer watches as the young person feeds grain into the grinder. The motion is simple and repetitive, but because the observer is watching, they notice something. Every few minutes, the young person coughs, a harsh, deep cough. That seems to shake their whole body. The observer watches this for several more cycles, and then the young person coughs, so hard that they have to stop working. For a moment, they turn away from the grinder. Their whole body is shaking. When they turn back, their eyes are watering. There's dust covering their face. They continue the work anyway. The observer asks a question. If the dust is always this bad? The young person says yes. It's always bad. The dust never stops. If you're going to work in a mill, you're going to breathe dust. That's just part of it. The observer asks if the young person's lungs hurt. The young person touches their chest. They say yes. But there's work that needs to be done. The grain needs to be ground. If the young person doesn't do it, the miller will find someone else. Who will? The observer nods. They can see that there's no point in expressing sympathy. The young person has accepted this as part of their existence. The observer leaves the mill. Outside, the air is clearer, though the observer can still taste dust in their mouth. The sun is very low now. It's approaching that time when day is becoming evening. The light has that quality, where everything is slightly shadowed and warm-toned. The observer's tiredness is becoming more pronounced. The observer makes their way back to their lodgings. The room is the same as it was this morning. Small, simple, with a small window. That's now showing the sunset. The observer sits on the edge of the bed. They feel the accumulated tiredness of the day settle into their bones. The observer lies back. They stare at the ceiling. The observer is thinking about what they've seen. The field laborer breaking the earth. The fuller working cloth through water and substances. The tanner scraping hides. The young person in the mill breathing dust. The observer is thinking about how this work continues. It continues because it has to. It continues because people depend on it. It continues because there are people who have been born into these roles and see no way out of them. The observer is thinking about the weight of it, not the weight of a single day, but the weight of years of this, years of breaking earth, years of standing in moisture and sour smells, years of scraping hides, years of breathing dust. The observer drifts into something. That's not quite sleep, but not quite wakefulness. It's the state between the two, where thoughts become less coherent and more like impressions. Time passes. The light fades from the window. The room becomes dark. The observer eventually falls into sleep. But before sleep fully comes, the observer is aware of sounds from the town. Someone moving through the streets with a cart. Someone else calling out. Activity that's different from the daytime activity. The observer realizes that this is when night work begins. The observer should get up and observe this. But the observer is tired. The observer's body is demanding rest. The observer sleeps. In the early morning, before dawn, the observer wakes. The observation from yesterday comes back. The observer realizes there's work. That happens at night. Work that the observer has missed. The observer decides to get up and explore. The streets are different now. They're quieter but also busier. In a strange way, there's activity, but it's the activity of night work. It's hurried and efficient and happens in the darkness. The observer sees a cart. being wheeled through the streets. It's a worker moving through the town. With purpose. The observer follows. The worker arrives at a building. They enter. They're inside for a short time. When they exit, something in the cart has increased. They move to the next location. This is the gong farmer. This is the work. That empties the pits and the places where waste collects. It's work that has to happen, but work that nobody wants to see or think about during the day. The observer watches from a distance as the gong farmer continues this work. The work is efficient and practiced. The gong farmer moves quickly through the dark streets, doing what has to be done. The observer decides not to follow closer. The work is necessary, and the observer respects that necessity. But the observer also senses that this work that's best observed from a distance. The observer returns to their lodgings. As the sky begins to lighten again, another day is beginning. Another day of work will unfold. The field laborer will return to the field. The fuller will return to the vats. The tanner will return to the hides. The young person in the mill will return to feeding grain into the grinder. The observer rests for a few hours, then rises again. This morning is similar to yesterday morning, but the observer is no longer unfamiliar with the town. The observer knows where things are. The observer knows the pattern of work. The observer doesn't return to the field. Instead, the observer walks through the town and enters a building. That seemed to be a household. Inside, there's someone preparing food. This is a household worker. This is someone whose work is different from the crafts the observer has seen. This is someone whose work is scattered across many different tasks. The household worker is preparing food, but the observer can see evidence of other work. There are clothes that have been mended. There's a hearth that's been cleaned. There are surfaces that have been wiped down. The observer watches as the household worker chops vegetables, places them in a pot. The observer watches as the worker tends the fire, checks on something that's cooking. This work is different. It's less focused than the other work. It's more about maintaining the space and the people in the space. It's work that's largely invisible to the people who benefit from it. The observer asks how much of the day is spent on this work. The household worker says it depends on the day. Some days there are more people to feed. Some days there are more clothes to mend. But basically the work never stops. There's always something that needs doing. The observer asks if the worker rests. The household worker laughs. They say rest comes after the family has eaten and gone to bed. Then there's an hour or two when the work slows down. That's when rest happens. The observer realizes something. This work is perhaps the most foundational of all. This is the work that makes daily life possible for everyone else. But it's also the least acknowledged. It's assumed to exist. It's assumed to happen. Nobody thanks the household worker for making the food or maintaining the space. The observer sits down and watches this work continue. Hours pass. The morning becomes afternoon. Food is prepared. It's served. It's cleaned up. New food is prepared for the evening. This rhythm continues. The observer becomes aware of how much mental effort is required for this work. Even though it's routine, you have to remember what needs to be done next. You have to time things correctly so that different elements come together at the same moment. By late afternoon, the observer is tired just from watching. The observer leaves the household and walks through the town again. The light is that golden quality again. The day is ending. The work is winding down. The observer passes people carrying things, people moving from workplaces to homes, people settling in for the evening. The observer arrives back at their lodgings as darkness is falling. This time the observer doesn't sleep immediately. The observer sits by the window and thinks about what they've seen. The observer is thinking about a particular thing. All of this work continues because it has to. It continues whether the people doing it are happy or tired or sick. It continues because people depend on it, because society's built on this work. The observer is thinking about how the clothes they wear exist, because of the fuller, how the shoes they wear exist, because of the tanner, how the food they eat exists, because of the field laborer and the household worker, how the flour they use exists, because the young person in the mill breathes dust every day. The observer is thinking about how much of the history and how much of society is built on work that's invisible to the people who benefit from it, built on labor that's routine and repetitive and taken for granted. The observer is thinking about the people they've observed. They're not heroes. They're not doing anything dramatic. They're just continuing. They're just showing up and doing the work that has to be done. The observer realizes something. That's hard to put into words, but feels important. The observer realizes that the comfort of any age, any society, rests on people doing work that they'd probably rather not do. Medieval society was built on this work, and the work was done. The observer lies down. Sleep comes more easily this time. The observer's body is used to the rhythm now. The observer has observed enough. The observer's mind settles. The observer dreams of fields, and water and dust and hides, and heat and cold, and hands that are rough from work. In the morning, the observer wakes and understands something else. The observer understands that this work is being done right now, while the observer slept. Someone was working. Someone was breaking earth. Someone was standing in moisture. Someone was scraping hides. Someone was breathing dust. Someone was feeding a household. Someone was moving through the darkness with a cart. The observer understands that this work will continue. Tomorrow the same work will happen, the day after the same work, and the day after that. The observer realizes that what's remarkable about this work is not that it's difficult. What's remarkable is that it continues, year after year, generation after generation. People show up and do this work. The observer leaves the lodging. The town is already awake and working. The observer walks through it one more time, observing. The field is visible from the edge of town. The field laborer is there, starting the day's work. The same motion as before, the body doing what it knows how to do. The fuller's workspace has smoke rising from it. Work is happening inside. The cloth is being processed. The tanner's workspace is open. Work is being done. The mill is turning. The young person is feeding grain. The household workers are preparing food and maintaining spaces. All of it is continuing. All of it is necessary. All of it is being done by people who are tired and aching, but who continue anyway. The observer realizes that they've been here for only 2 days. But in those 2 days, they've understood something about how the world actually works. Not the grand history. That gets written down. But the real work that sustains everything. The observer finds a quiet place to sit and rest. The observer sits and watches the light change as the day progresses. The observer watches people moving about their work. The observer watches the repetition and the routine and the continuation. The observer is beginning to understand that there's something almost peaceful about this. The work continues. The people continue. There's a rhythm to it that's larger than any individual person. The observer is beginning to understand that these people are not victims. Though the work is hard, they're not heroes. Though the work is essential, they're simply people doing what they've been born into or trained to do. They're doing what has to be done. The observer sits as the sun moves across the sky. Hours pass. The light begins to change. Toward evening again, the observer has been sitting in the same place for most of the day. The observer's legs are stiff. The observer's back is aching. The observer understands a little bit of what the field laborer feels at the end of a day. The observer stands and stretches. The observer walks slowly through the town, toward their lodgings. The town is settling again. The work of the day is winding down. The evening work is beginning. The observer reaches their room. The observer lies down. They feel the weight of 2 days of observation settle into their body. The observer is thinking about something that the field laborer said, that the work is the work. You do what you can, and then you rest. The observer is thinking about the fuller, standing in moisture and sour smells, doing the work that has to be done. The observer is thinking about the tanner, with stains that won't wash out, doing the work that has to be done. The observer is thinking about the young person in the mill, breathing dust, doing the work that has to be done. The observer is thinking about the household worker, doing the work that's invisible, doing the work that has to be done. The observer is thinking about the gong farmer, working in darkness, doing the work that has to be done. All of these people are doing work that they didn't choose, work that's difficult in various ways, work that leaves marks on their bodies and changes who they are. But they're continuing. They're showing up. They're doing what has to be done. The observer is thinking about how this has been true for centuries. Medieval people faced this same reality. People before them faced it. People after them will face it. The observer is thinking about how the comfort of any age rests on this work, on people who are willing to do what has to be done, even when it's difficult, even when it's unpleasant, even when nobody particularly thanks them for it. The observer is thinking about this, and then the observer is not thinking anymore. Sleep comes. The observer sleeps deeply and without dreams. The observer sleeps the way a person sleeps, after a day of honest observation, the way a person sleeps, when they've understood something true about the world. Outside the town continues. The work continues. The night worker moves through the streets with their cart. The field rests, the mill slows. The household workers do the final tasks. Before sleep, the town settles into darkness and quiet. And in that darkness and quiet, in that space between one day and the next, the observer rests. The observer's dreams are simple. Fields and water, and the motion of hands doing work. When the observer wakes in the morning, the sun is already up. The day has already begun. The observer lies still for a moment and listens to the sounds of the town. The sounds of work beginning again. The observer realizes that they need to leave soon. They need to return to where they came from. They need to leave this place and this work behind. But something in them will remember. Something in them will carry forward the knowledge of what happens here, the knowledge that comfort is built on labor, that society is built on people who are willing to do work. That's difficult and unpleasant. That history is not made by the people who make speeches or write things down, but by the people who show up every day and do the work that has to be done. The observer rises and begins to pack their few belongings. The observer takes one last walk through the town. They pass the field. The field laborer is there, breaking earth. The work continues. They pass the fuller's workspace. Cloth is being processed. The work continues. They pass the tanner's place. Hides are being scraped. The work continues. They pass the mill. The young person is feeding grain. The work continues. They pass the households, where workers are maintaining spaces and preparing food. The work continues. The observer leaves the town by the same path they arrived. The town begins to fade behind them. The sounds fade. The particular smells of the town fade. But the knowledge remains. The observer carries with them the understanding that every cloth they wear was made by someone standing in moisture, and sour smells. Every shoe they wear was made by someone with stained hands. Every meal they eat was prepared by someone doing invisible work. Every comfort they experience is built on labor that they don't see and probably don't think about. The observer carries with them the faces of the people they observed, the field laborer, the fuller, the tanner, the young person in the mill, the household worker, the gong farmer. The observer carries with them the understanding that these people are not exceptional. These people are the ordinary foundation that all of society is built on. The observer walks on, returning to their normal life. And as evening approaches, and the observer finds a place to rest, the observer thinks about the town they've just left. The observer thinks about the work that continues there even now, the work that will continue tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. The observer settles down to sleep. The observer's mind is quiet. The observer's body is tired in a way that's honest and earned. The observer sleeps, and in the darkness, in the quiet, in the space between wakefulness and sleep, the observer understands that this is real. This is how the world works. This is how history is made, not by the people who are remembered, but by the people who continue, who show up, who do the work. The observer sleeps, and the work continues. In that medieval town, in that space the observer has left behind. The field laborer rises and walks to the field. The fuller returns to the vats. The tanner begins another day of scraping. The young person in the mill prepares to breathe dust again. The household workers begin the work. That never ends. The gong farmer sleeps, waiting for evening. All of it continues. The work continues. Human history is built on this. The observer sleeps, and in that sleep the observer rests. In the knowledge of having seen something true, sleep comes. The observer drifts. The world around them becomes quieter. The town fades. The work continues. But the observer no longer hears it. The observer is at rest. In the darkness, in the stillness, there is nothing but the gentle rise and fall of breathing. The observer sleeps, and sleep is all that remains.